In this submodule, we're going to focus on monitoring. So why do we want to monitor? Well, primarily because it gives us the opportunity to take the right decisions based on thorough knowledge about how the development intervention is progressing. It also allows us to identify potential problems in due time. Then monitoring also serves a need for documentation. Most often, organizations who have invested money in a development intervention want to know about the progress. Thirdly, we monitor because we want to learn and use this learning to improve our programs. Monitoring is also related to the use of resources. We want to know whether our use of resources is appropriate in relation to the progress. And finally, monitoring is also used to ensure transparency and accountability, both internally and externally. In results-based monitoring, we monitor both the implementation at input and activity levels, and we also monitor results at output, outcome, and impact levels. Implementation monitoring addresses compliance, focusing on the question, did they do what they had planned? Did they mobilize the inputs and undertake the activities? But implementation monitoring does not in itself provide policymakers, managers, and stakeholders with an understanding of the success or failure of the intervention. Results-based monitoring, however, addresses the so what question. If activities have been implemented, have outputs then been generated? And if outputs have been generated, what are the effects that we can see on outcome and impact level as a consequence? The higher you get up in the intervention logic, the more difficult it becomes to tell whether a given change can be directly attributed to the activities of our development intervention. But it is still very important to monitor at the results level also. Often, there are different levels of monitoring and reporting related to a given development intervention. At the input level, we do financial monitoring and make financial reports. At the activity level, we monitor progress. To what extent did we do what we planned? And we make progress reports. At output level, we are interested in knowing to what degree we have been able to produce the expected outputs, and we typically mention that in an annual or biannual progress report. At outcome level, we monitor or look for changes. That could be behavioral changes as a consequence of the production of the outputs. When we set up our monitoring system, we try to use existing or easily available data to inform us about the desired changes at outcome level and avoid costly surveys, etc. Finally, at the impact level, monitoring will often consist of specific surveys and reports that sometimes are only made by the end of the intervention and thereby tends to be more of an evaluation than monitoring. But on longer term interventions, you will have to look for signs of change at impact level even during the implementation. So, how do you design a results-based monitoring system? Well, 6 steps are suggested for the process of designing and using a results-based monitoring system. First, you have to agree on your outcomes and goals. This work is being done as part of formulating the intervention logic based on an analysis of the existing and the desired future situation. That corresponds to what we have gone through in modules 1 and 2. Secondly, you have to select relevant indicators and means of verification at output, outcome, and impact levels. Thirdly, you have to collect baseline information on the current situation so you know what to compare with. Fourthly, you also have to set targets for the indicators, both quantitatively, qualitatively, and in time. We have gone through points 2, 3, and 4 in Module 3. Once you start implementing your program, you then have to regularly collect data to inform the indicators and assessing to what degree the targets are met. And finally, you will also have to analyze the data and probably have dialogue with some of the central stakeholders to find out why things have developed or not developed the way they have. Then, once we have set up our monitoring system, then how do we monitor in the implementation phase? Well, at the overall long-term impact level, monitoring often has to be conducted through occasional ad hoc surveys rather than regular data collection. This stems from the complexity of indicators typically associated with development objectives, requiring measurements of poverty levels, of changes in income, vulnerability, etc. It is often impossible to measure such indicators through the collection of routine data, which makes them expensive to monitor. At the same time, they seek to measure rather slow developments, making it more appropriate to monitor changes with fairly long intervals, for instance, once every 2 or 3 or 4 years. At the outcome level, administrative data will often be available for monitoring, for instance, morbidity rates in the health sector, pass rates in the education sector, crop yields in agriculture, etc. Since such data is already part of the sector's administrative information system, it is cheap to exploit and will usually be available on an annual basis. At the output level, monitoring indicators tend to consist of tangible products, for instance, the number of courses or workshops conducted, length of roads built or rehabilitated, number of teachers trained, etc. Therefore, data collection will be comparatively easy and can be done frequently, for instance, quarterly. At the activity level, monitoring is even more straightforward as it is linked to the budget. Finally, another 3 aspects need to be monitored, although they may well not be formally included in the monitoring system, and therefore formal indicators tend not to be formulated for these. The first one are the inputs. These have to be monitored in terms of their availability, timeliness, quality, and consumption. The accounts are often the tool to monitor consumption of financial inputs. Risks have been mentioned earlier. These have to be monitored in terms of the degree of threat that they pose to the attainment of the program objectives. In turn, the monitoring findings must prompt considerations on how to mitigate the risks in case they appear to grow worse. And finally, assumptions. The validity of the assumptions must be monitored, and the findings used to judge the continued feasibility of the development intervention and the theory of change. In practical terms, it will be useful to develop a specific monitoring plan. The indicators and means of verification that have been agreed upon and inserted in the results framework constitute the backbone of the monitoring plan. First, you have to consider for whose sake the data is collected and analyzed. Who's going to receive the data and what are they going to use it for? In the monitoring plan, you need then to identify what data to collect and where to find them. Then you will have to decide when and how often data is to be collected. Data collection methods have to be determined. Is it just collecting statistics, or do we need to conduct interviews, surveys, etc.? Then, who will collect the data? And do they have the necessary time and logistical resources to do so? And finally, one thing is collecting data, yet another is to analyze and report. This responsibility also has to be determined. Finally, as mentioned on the previous slide, we also need to monitor risks and assumptions. The monitoring plan should indicate the responsibility and frequency of this also. A monitoring plan can have various forms. Here's an example of one where you can summarize the indicators with their baseline and targets, then the means of verification, the responsibility, and finally also indicate the monitoring of the most important assumptions. Remember that monitoring systems and plans shall be kept as simple as possible. Stick to need to know and avoid too much nice to know. Before we finish the submodule on monitoring, a final remark on the monitoring or follow-up on results produced in relation to the expenditure. The comparison between financial and physical progress is an important aspect of monitoring that often receives high attention from funders of development interventions. Here we present an example from a Danita training in financial program management, where we suggest a simple method for comparing physical progress with financial expenditure. Imagine that we have a development intervention with 5 outputs leading to 2 different outcomes. At a certain time, for instance by the end of a trimester, we want to monitor the progress. So we compare the achieved results to date with the target. As can be seen at this point in time, the program has not yet reached the targets on outputs 1.1, 1.3, and 2.2. But they seem to have overperformed on outputs 1.2 and 2.1. When we then look at the resources used to produce the outputs, we also compare actually expended resources with the budgeted ones. Here it becomes clear that we are above budget for outputs 1.1 and 2.1. When we then put together the two comparisons, we can see how much result we have got for our money, which is, by the way, the focus of value for money studies. When we have figures below 1, as is the case for output 1.2 and 2.1, then we have gotten more results for fewer resources. On the other hand, when we have used more resources to produce the results than expected, then the figures are higher than 1. In this example, it is clear that there's a problem regarding output 1.3, where they have only produced 10% of the results, but used 45% of the budget. This kind of monitoring helps you as a program manager to identify problems and act on them in due time. Now it's your turn to do a reflection exercise on monitoring. Use the project or program that you used for the stakeholder analysis, the problem analysis, the theory of change, the assumptions, the risks, and the indicators. Then first, reflect upon how you will monitor results on output, outcome, and impact levels on your program. If it is already stated, then you can assess what has been done. Secondly, suggest who, when, and how data are to be collected and analyzed. And then thirdly, consider whether there are sufficient financial, human, and logistical resources allocated to the monitoring of the program. Remember to pause the PowerPoint video while you're doing the exercise. So, welcome back from the exercise. Hopefully you have had an opportunity to think about or review the monitoring system of your program. Before we go on to the last submodule on the RBM course, there are a few key points that we want you to remember about monitoring. First, results-based monitoring focuses not only on activities and progress, but also and especially on results at output, outcome, and impact levels. Secondly, remember also to monitor risks and assumptions. They're crucial to the success of the development intervention. And thirdly, remember to make monitoring ambitions realistic by sticking to need to know and taking available financial, human, and logistical resources into consideration. We will now turn to the last submodule of the RBM course, which is about how to design and undertake evaluations.